He showed up at her fence line on a Tuesday morning like he owned the county. Harold Voss didn't knock. Men like Harold Voss never knocked. He rode straight through Clara Whitlock's front gate, the one hanging crooked on one hinge since September, and stopped his horse 6 feet from her porch steps. He had 2 men with him. They always had 2 men with them. Mrs. Whitlock. He didn't take his hat off. I'm going to need your answer by Friday. Clara was holding a bucket of feed grain. Her knuckles went white around the handle. My answer hasn't changed, Mr. Voss. He smiled. That was the worst part. He smiled like she'd said something that amused a child. Your note comes due in 11 days. The bank's not going to extend it again, not after I've had a conversation with Mr. Alderman. He paused, letting that sink in like a blade going slow. I'm offering you fair market price, Clara. Below fair, honestly, because I'm a generous man. Get off my land. He turned his horse around, easy, unhurried, like a man who had already won something and was just waiting for the paperwork to confirm it. Friday, he said without looking back. She stood there holding that bucket until the sound of hooves faded completely. Then she set it down on the porch step, sat beside it, and put her face in her hands. That was the morning Gideon Mercer walked up the road and saw her fence falling apart. If that was your land, your husband's sweat, your own blood, and someone smiled at you like that, what would you do? Stay with us. This story is just getting started, and I promise you, it goes places you won't expect. If you believe in people who refuse to quit, subscribe to this channel right now and follow every part of this story to the very end. Hit that like button, drop a comment, and tell me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The fence was the first thing Gideon Mercer noticed because it was the kind of thing a carpenter could not look away from. 3 rails split and dragging in the dirt. 2 posts leaning like old men who'd given up on standing straight. Wire rusted through in places, twisted back on itself where someone, probably a woman alone, probably in the dark, probably after a long day of everything else, had tried to make it hold together with whatever she had. He'd seen worse fences. He'd built better ones at 16 years old with borrowed tools and his father's voice in his ear, telling him to set the post deeper, always deeper, because a post that won't hold in winter is no post at all. He stopped walking. He had been walking since before sunrise, which was a habit he'd picked up in the 14 months since Hayes City, when walking was the only thing that kept him from sitting still long enough to think about what he'd done. He had 43 cents left in his coat pocket. He had a canvas tool bag over one shoulder that weighed more than was reasonable for a man who had almost nothing. He had a blister on his left heel that had broken open sometime around dawn and was making every step its own small punishment. He was not looking for work. He told himself that every morning and most afternoons. But the fence. He shifted the tool bag on his shoulder and stood at the edge of the road, looking at the property. It was a wheat ranch, or it had been. The fields had been cut and the stalks were brown and low in the thin November light. The barn at the back of the property was large enough to tell you it had been somebody's ambition once. The house was small and practical, with a porch that needed new boards on the left side where the wood had gone soft and dark from water damage. There was a kitchen garden along the south wall, mostly dead now, a few dried herb stalks still standing in the frost-hardened soil. It was the kind of place that had been fought for. He could see that without being told. He was still standing there, not quite deciding, when the front door of the house opened and the woman came out with a feed bucket and walked straight past him toward the small chicken coop near the east fence line. She didn't look at him. Her eyes were somewhere else. She moved like a person carrying something invisible that was significantly heavier than the bucket. Gideon watched her scatter feed to the chickens. She did it the same way she walked, efficient, mechanical, her attention clearly. Somewhere it was not welcome to be. He should have kept walking. Your fence is falling apart, he said. She turned and looked at him. She wasn't startled. She'd known he was there. She just hadn't cared enough to acknowledge him until he spoke. She was younger than he'd expected. Late 20s, maybe 30. Brown hair pulled back and pinned in a way that suggested it had started the day tidy and lost the argument by mid-morning. She had the kind of face that would have been pretty if it wasn't currently occupied by exhaustion and something harder than exhaustion, something closer to the look a person gets when they have been fighting the same battle for so long, they've stopped believing it can be won and started fighting it purely out of principle. She looked at the fence, then at him, then at the fence again. So am I, she said. Fix whichever one you can. She went back to her chickens. Gideon stood there for a moment longer than was comfortable, holding his tool bag, watching her. He could not have told you exactly what it was that made him set the bag down and walk toward the fence rather than back toward the road. He would have said later, if pressed, that it was just something to do. That's what he would have said. He walked the fence line first. Old habit. You walked it before you touched it because you needed to know what you were actually dealing with before you started making assumptions. 3 posts needed replacing entirely. 4 needed to be pulled and reset deeper. The rails were salvageable if you were willing to trim the split ends and add splices. The wire was mostly usable if you gave it time and didn't rush the tension. He went back to his tool bag. He had been working for approximately 40 minutes when he heard the porch door open again and her footsteps crossing toward him. She stopped about 10 feet away and watched him work without speaking. He didn't stop to introduce himself or explain himself. He just kept working. "You know what you're doing," she said finally. It wasn't a compliment exactly. It was more like an observation she'd made reluctantly. "I should." He drove the post setter down. "It's all I know how to do." She was quiet again. He finished setting the post and moved to the next one. "You want to tell me your name?" she said. "Gideon Mercer." "Clara Whitlock." She paused. "You're not from around here." "I'm not from anywhere particular." Another pause. He could feel her deciding something. "I can't pay you much," she said. "You haven't offered to pay me anything yet." "I'm getting there." There was something in her voice that wasn't quite humor but was in the same neighborhood. "I have a bunkhouse. Hasn't been used in a while. There's a stove in it that works, probably. I can offer meals and $1.50 a week until the end of the month, and after that we'll see what's what." He stopped working and turned to look at her directly for the first time. She was watching him with the careful eyes of someone who had learned, probably the hard way, to pay attention to what a person did with their face when she made them an offer. He thought about the 43 cents in his pocket, the blister on his heel, the fact that sleeping outside in Kansas in November was survivable, but only barely, and only if you had more optimism than he currently possessed. "The stove definitely works," he said. "Or it doesn't. I'd need to know before I agreed to anything." Something shifted in her face, just slightly, like a board that had been nailed down crooked finally settling into its proper place. "I'll get you a lamp," she said. "You can check it yourself." The stove worked. It took him 20 minutes to figure out that the flue needed to be cleared, and then it worked. He stood in the small bunkhouse in the lamplight, looking at the bunk frame. No mattress, just rope webbing, and the single wooden chair and the potbelly stove now ticking quietly with the first heat it had generated in what looked like at least a year based on the dust. And he made a decision he was not certain was wise. He stayed. I was up before dawn the next morning, which Clara discovered when she came out to start morning chores and found him already at the fence line with a lantern propped on a post, working by its light. She stood on the porch in her coat and boots and watched him for a minute before she went back inside. When she called him in for breakfast 45 minutes later, she had made enough for 2 people without giving it any particular thought, which she noticed only after she'd set the plates and found herself mildly irritated at herself about it. He came in, washed his hands at the basin, and sat down at the table without being told twice. "How long do you figure the fence line takes?" she said. "At the pace I was going this morning? 3 more full days on the main perimeter. There's a section along the back 40 that's worse. Maybe another 2 days. I need the main line done before Monday." He looked up. "Why Monday?" She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. "I'm expecting cattle move through. A neighbor's driving his herd to the rail station, and he's agreed to pay me a fee to use my land as a through corridor, but only if the fence line is solid. His cattle spook through broken fence, and I lose the fee, and probably the goodwill. 3 days is enough for the main line if the weather holds." "The weather won't hold." She said it the same way someone says the sun will rise, as a simple fact she'd stopped bothering to argue with. He looked at her across the table. "When doesn't the weather hold?" "Around here?" "Generally when it would be most inconvenient." He thought about that. "I'll start on the back line today. Work the main line tomorrow and the day after. If snow holds until Thursday, we're fine. And if it doesn't?" He shrugged. "Then we work in the snow." She studied him for a moment with those careful eyes. You're not one of those men who makes promises he can't keep just to make the morning feel better?" "No," he said. "I've done that. I don't anymore." She accepted this and poured him more coffee. She could not have explained why that answer satisfied her. It just did. He worked. That was the plain, unambiguous fact of his first week at the Whitlock Ranch. He worked the way men work when working is the only thing standing between them and the inside of their own head. Which is to say, he worked with a kind of focused intensity that had nothing sentimental about it and everything practical. Clara watched him the way she watched all things, carefully and without showing it. She'd had a hired hand the previous spring. A young man from the next county over who was enthusiastic in the first 2 weeks and increasingly creative about disappearing after that. Before him there had been 2 brothers who were competent enough but spent their evenings drinking in a way that made mornings unreliable. Her husband James had hired reliable men sometimes, and she had watched how he found them, which was not by asking about their skills or their references, but by watching them when they didn't know they were being watched. Gideon Mercer did not look different when he thought no one was watching. That was unusual enough to be worth noting. He was not a cheerful man. He wasn't sullen either. He just moved through the world with a quiet that was different from sadness, though it wasn't entirely separate from sadness either. He spoke when something needed saying. He asked questions when he needed information. He did not offer details about himself unless she asked directly, and sometimes not even then. She asked him on the 4th day where he'd come from before this. He said, "West of here," and kept working. She asked what he'd done before he became a man walking the roads of Kansas with a tool bag. There was a pause that lasted approximately 1 second longer than a normal pause. "Built things," he said. "Carpenter?" "Among other things." She let it sit there. She'd learned years ago that silence was a better shovel than questions when you were trying to dig something out of a person. He didn't fill the silence. He was, she noted, frustratingly immune to silence as a tool. That evening, after supper, she was going over the account book at the kitchen table when she heard a sound from outside that she could not immediately identify. She went to the window. He was sitting on the bunkhouse step in the cold, in the dark. And she had to look twice to be sure. He was just sitting there, not doing anything, just sitting with his forearms on his knees and his head slightly bowed, looking at the ground. She watched him for a moment. Then she went back to her account book. Some things were not her business. She had enough of her own. The snow came on Thursday. Not a blizzard, not yet. Just the first serious snow of the season, coming down gray and steady from a sky that meant business. She woke to find 4 inches on the ground and Gideon already at the main fence line, working. She brought him coffee without asking if he wanted it. He took the cup with both hands and drank without stopping work entirely, holding the cup in one hand and setting a rail with the other, which required a level of coordination she found vaguely impressive. "Main line's done," he said. "I finished the last section at the back corner about an hour ago." She looked at him. "In the dark?" "Had the lantern." The cattle came through on Saturday, 43 head moving in a loose, muddy column across her east field. The fences held. Every single one of them held. Clara collected the fee, $12, which was less than she needed and more than nothing, and watched the last of the herd disappear through the far gate. When she turned around, Gideon was already pulling the gate closed and securing it, moving with the unhurried efficiency of someone who did not need to be told what the next thing was. She said, "Thank you." He said, "You're paying me." "I know I am," she said. "I'm thanking you anyway." He nodded once, like a man accepting a weight he wasn't entirely sure he'd earned. It was in the second week that she caught the first real glimpse of whatever it was he was carrying. She'd asked him, reasonably, she thought, to look at the barn roof on the northwest corner where 2 boards had pulled free in the wind and were letting in weather. He'd gone up the ladder without comment. She'd heard him moving around up there for a few minutes. Then the moving stopped. She waited. After a while, she went out to see. He was standing on the roof, on the peak, completely still, not looking at the damage, just standing there with his hands at his sides and his face pointed toward the horizon, and she could see even from the ground that something was wrong. He was pale. She could see it from 10 feet below. His jaw was set like a man who was holding something shut by pure will. "Gideon." He didn't answer immediately. "Gideon, come down." He came down the ladder, slowly, step by step, like a man learning to use his legs again after a long illness. When he reached the ground, he stepped away from the ladder and stood with his back against the barn wall and said nothing, looking at the ground. She waited. "I'll fix it," he said finally. His voice was level, but it cost him something. "I know you will," she said quietly. "That's not what I'm asking." He looked up. The look on his face was the look of a man who had been asked a question he'd been hoping nobody would think to ask. "Heights?" she said. The pause again. The long one. "Not heights," he said. Then, like he was pulling it up from somewhere he'd rather not reach. "Roofs." She didn't ask anything else. She went inside and heated the coffee that had gone cold from sitting too long and brought it out to him, and he took it, and neither of them said anything about it, and by the following morning he had fixed the corner boards without being reminded. She noticed that his hands shook slightly on the ladder going up. She noticed that they were completely steady by the time he had the first board in his hand. She noticed these things and kept them to herself. Harold Voss came back on a Friday. She'd been expecting it. He came on Fridays because he was a man who liked to end his business weeks with the feeling of having accomplished something, and making Clara Whitlock feel small was, for Harold Voss, a form of accomplishment. This time he had 3 men with him. She was in the yard when they rode in, which was worse than being on the porch because it meant she had no high ground, literally or otherwise. She stood her ground anyway. "Mrs. Whitlock." Same tone. Same absence of hat removal. "You missed our Friday deadline." "I didn't agree to any Friday deadline." "I gave you one. Seemed reasonable." He looked around the property with the expression of a man cataloging something he intends to own. His eyes traveled to the fence line, the newly repaired, solid, dignified fence line, and something shifted in his face, just slightly. "You've been making improvements." "I've been maintaining my property." "With help, it looks like." His eyes found Gideon, who had come around the side of the barn and stopped at a respectful distance, watching. "New hire?" "That's not your concern." Voss looked at Gideon with the kind of look men like Voss give men they've already dismissed. "You know whose land you're working, son?" Gideon said nothing. He just stood there. His face was the face of a man who had been talked to like that before and had stopped finding it interesting. "This land's going to belong to the Voss Land Trust inside of 30 days, Harold said, turning back to Clara. "Working it right now is a little like rearranging furniture in a burning house." "Then you'd better hope you know someone in the fire business," Clara said, "because this house isn't burning." Voss's jaw tightened. Not much. He was too controlled for that. But enough. "Your note, Clara. 11 days. Unless you've suddenly come into money I don't know about." "You don't know a lot of things, Mr. Voss." He looked at her for a moment with an expression that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite admiration, but lived in the uncomfortable space between them. Then he turned his horse and rode out, his 3 men falling in behind him without a word. The front gate that had been hanging on one hinge when Gideon arrived, swung shut cleanly behind them. Gideon had repaired it on day 2. Clara stood in the yard after they'd gone and breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth, which was something she did when she was keeping herself from shaking. She heard footsteps behind her. "He's going to be back," Gideon said. "I know." "What's the note?" She hesitated. She was not accustomed to answering that kind of question, not to a man she'd known for 2 weeks. But something about the way he asked it, not curious, not pitying, just asking because it was relevant to a problem he was trying to understand, made her answer. $240, due the 2nd of December. He was quiet for a moment. "How close are you?" "To having it?" She looked at the fence, at the repaired gate, at the ranch that was still standing because she had refused to let it fall. "Not close enough." He nodded slowly. Nod of defeat. A nod of someone taking inventory. "Then we figure out the rest," he said. She turned to look at him. "That's not your problem." "I'm standing on your land," he said, "eating your food, taking your wages, sleeping in your bunkhouse. I think I get a vote on what I consider my problem." She looked at him for a long time, long enough to make most men uncomfortable. He held it without flinching. "All right," she said finally. "Then let's figure out the rest." She turned and walked toward the house, and after a moment he picked up his tool bag and followed her, and the repaired gate held firm against the rising afternoon wind. That night, Clara sat at the kitchen table with the account book open in front of her and a pencil she kept forgetting to use. The numbers were not new. She'd looked at them so many times in the past 3 months that she could have written them from memory in the dark, which was essentially what she was doing now. staring at them without really seeing them, running the same calculation she'd run 100 times before and arriving at the same answer, which was that she was short. $51 short, to be exact. Not catastrophically short. Not laughably short. Just short enough that it felt like cruelty, like someone had measured the distance between where she stood and where she needed to be and had chosen the gap specifically to be as discouraging as possible without being outright impossible. She heard the bunkhouse door open and close. Gideon, going to bed. She looked at the window, black outside, the cold pressing against the glass, and thought about what he'd said. Then we figure out the rest. She'd spent 2 years figuring things out by herself. It was not that she was proud of it. It was that she'd had no alternative, and when you do something with no alternative long enough, it starts to feel like identity. James had been gone since March of last year. A horse accident. The kind of stupid and final thing that happens on ranches and always will happen on ranches. And you either accept that or you sell the land and go somewhere that accidents are softer. And in the 14 months since then, every decision on this property had been hers alone. Every mistake, every correction, every sleepless night with the account book, having someone say we was stranger than she'd expected. She closed the account book and went to bed without resolving anything. What? In the morning, she found Gideon at the kitchen table before she'd gotten the stove going, which should have been annoying and was instead just a fact of life she was apparently already adjusting to. He had a piece of paper in front of him and was writing on it in a hand that was more careful than she'd expected from a man who spent most of his time outdoors. "What are you doing?" she said. "Making a list." He didn't look up. "Sit down. Tell me what you know about the neighboring properties." She stood in the kitchen doorway in her coat because the room hadn't warmed up yet and looked at him. "Why?" "Because you need $51 in 11 days, and the fence work is essentially done, and the question is what else you can sell or offer that people around here will actually pay for." He looked up then. "Unless I have the number wrong." She hadn't told him the number. She thought back through the previous evening and realized she had, in fact, told him the number, $240, and she'd told him the 12 from the cattle fee and the 47 she had in the cash box, and apparently he'd done the subtraction while she wasn't paying attention. She sat down. "The Hendersons to the north have been having trouble with their south barn," she said. "The foundation's been shifting. Orville mentioned it at church in October, and I haven't heard that it got fixed." Gideon wrote that down. Who does Orville trust? His wife. Nobody else, really, she thought. He'd take a recommendation from Tom Garrett at the feed store, maybe. What about the other direction? The Callaway place is empty, has been since spring. The widow sold it to someone in Wichita who hasn't done anything with it yet. Farther south? The Beaumont brothers. They run cattle, not wheat. They don't like strangers, and they don't pay on time, so I'd put them at the bottom of any list. He wrote something and crossed something else out. She watched the way he worked through it. Not frantically, not with false optimism, just steadily, like a man building a fence. You identified the posts that needed replacing. You replaced them. You moved to the next one. "There's a miller on the East Road," she said. "Prentice. He had a granary expansion he was planning, and then his main carpenter left for Colorado in August. He mentioned it to me when I brought my last harvest in. He was frustrated about it." Gideon looked up. "He didn't say how much the work would cost," she said. "I know what it would cost," Gideon said. "Approximately, depending on the scope." He set the pencil down. "Can you arrange for me to talk to him?" "I can take you over there this morning if the road's clear." He nodded and stood up, and she realized she'd offered to do something, and he'd simply accepted the offer, which was also strange, and also, she noticed this with mild surprise, not unwelcome. She got the stove going and made breakfast, and they ate without much conversation, which was a kind of conversation in itself. The road to Prentice Mill was clear enough, though the cold had a mean edge to it that made the wagon seat feel like punishment. Clara drove. Gideon sat beside her with his hands on his knees and watched the countryside with the expression of a man who was thinking about something else. She let him think. They were about halfway there when he said, without preamble, "How long were you married?" She kept her eyes on the road. 6 years. Happy? Mostly. She paused. He was a hard man to fight with, not because he was mean. He wasn't. But because he was usually right, which is more irritating. She felt the edge of a smile cross her face before she could stop it. He had an opinion about everything on this ranch: where to plant, what to sell, which fence post to set deeper. He drove me absolutely crazy with it. She stopped talking. The smile faded on its own. Now I'd give a lot for one more argument with him, she said. Gideon didn't say he was sorry, which she appreciated. She'd had 2 years of people saying they were sorry, and it was kind of them, but it didn't do anything useful for the number in the account book. He built the barn, Gideon said. He and his brother, the summer before we married. That's why he wanted this land specifically. He said he could see where the barn would go before there was anything there. I thought that was the most peculiar thing. Who sees a barn that doesn't exist yet? She shook her head. He was like that, always seeing things that weren't there yet. That's not a bad way to be. No, she agreed. It isn't. They drove the rest of the way in quiet. Elias Prentice was a compact man in his 60s with a gray beard he clearly didn't think much about, and eyes that were sharp in a way that had nothing to do with education and everything to do with 40 years of watching people try to shortchange him. He met them in the mill yard with the unhurried suspicion of a man who had learned that people who showed up without an appointment generally wanted something. Mrs. Whitlock, he said. Then he looked at Gideon with no particular expression. Who's this? Gideon Mercer, Gideon said. I heard you're looking to expand your granary and you're short a carpenter. Prentice looked at Clara. You vouching for him? She thought about this for approximately 1 honest second. He rebuilt my entire main fence line in 4 days in November weather. The line held 43 head of cattle through it without giving. I'd say yes. Prentice made a sound that wasn't agreement or disagreement. Come look at what I'm dealing with, he said to Gideon, and walked toward the back of the mill without waiting. Clara stayed with the wagon. She watched the 2 men disappear around the corner of the building and sat on the wagon bench and listened to the wind move through the mill's weather vane, which needed oil and said so loudly. She could hear, distantly, the sound of Gideon asking questions. She couldn't make out words, just the low, regular cadence of someone gathering information, the same way he gathered everything, without hurry. They came back after 20 minutes. Prentice's expression had shifted into something that was not quite warmed up, but was noticeably less suspicious. Tuesday, Prentice said to Gideon. Gideon, you start Tuesday, and you do it right, no cutting corners. I'll pay you $65 when it's done. Clara kept her face entirely neutral. $65. Gideon said, 50 up front and 15 on completion. Prentice looked at him. That's not how I usually do things. I have a situation at the ranch I'm managing that requires funds before a certain date. The completion money in 2 weeks is fine. The 50 I'd need by Monday. Prentice chewed on this. He looked at Clara with those sharp eyes, clearly doing his own arithmetic about what a situation at the ranch meant. 40 up front, he said finally. 25 on completion. Gideon nodded once. Monday morning. They shook on it and left, and Clara waited until they were back on the road before she said anything. $65, she said. It's fair for the scope. He was expecting to pay more. Gideon shifted on the bench. He'll have the 40 ready Monday, which puts you at 87. You need 51 more than that. I know the math. Do you have anything else you can sell? She looked at the road. I have 2 breeding heifers I was going to hold until spring. If I sell them now, I lose the calves, but I'd get close to 30 each. Which 2? The ones in the East Pen? She stared at him. How do you know about the East Pen heifers? I've been working on your property for 2 weeks. I know which animals you're watching more carefully than the others. He said it without any particular self-satisfaction, just a fact. The smaller one has a limp on the left rear, has for a few days. She had noticed that too. She'd been hoping it would resolve itself. That reduces her sale value. Depends on who's buying. Henderson might take her anyway for the right price if he's looking to add to his breeding stock and not too particular about perfect soundness. Orville Henderson doesn't buy animals from women, she said flatly. He thinks it's bad luck. The silence that followed this was of the particularly tired variety. The silence of someone who has encountered that specific brand of nonsense often enough to be done being surprised by it. I could bring her over, Gideon said. It's my heifer. It is, he said. But you just said he won't buy from a woman. You want the principal or the money? She gripped the reins a little tighter. The horse, sensing something in her hands, flicked an ear back. The money, she said. Through her teeth, but she said it. Then I'll take her over tomorrow. He took both heifers. Henderson bought the sound one for $28 after minimal negotiation, and the lame one for $19 after slightly more. And when Gideon came back with $47 in his coat pocket and set it on the kitchen table in front of Clara, she looked at it for a long moment. "I could have gotten 30 for the sound one," she said. "Probably," he agreed. "But he also agreed to let you use his bull in the spring for the breeding season at no charge, which is worth more than the $2. She looked up. "He agreed to that?" "He mentioned it himself. I didn't ask." He pulled his coat off and hung it by the door. He said James always let him run his cattle across the south field during the dry years, and he figured it was time to return something. He seemed embarrassed it had taken him this long. Clara sat back in her chair and pressed the back of one hand against her mouth for a moment. "Orville Henderson," she said. "Huh. People are surprising sometimes. Don't get philosophical on me, Mercer." He came to the table and sat down across from her. "Here's where we are. You've got 47 from Henderson. You'll have 40 from Prentice on Monday. That's 87. You need 240 total, and you had 47 already in the cash box. I spent 12 of that on feed last week. Then 35 in the cash box. 87 plus 35 is 122. You need 118 more." "I know," she said. "I know the number." "I have $12, he said. She looked at him. "From wages you've paid me and what I had when I came." He put $12 on the table. "That's 134. I am not taking your money. It's not charity. I'm investing in the property I'm working on." "That is not how investing works." "Then consider it a loan." He pushed the $12 slightly toward her. "You can pay me back in spring wages if you want. I don't particularly care which way you call it." She looked at the money on the table. She looked at him. 106 short, she said. "Yes. What are you going to suggest?" He was quiet for a moment. "Do you know what your harvest actually brought in? Not what you banked, what the total was before expenses." $312. "And Voss knew that number?" She frowned. "I don't see how, the harvest records are with Morrison at the bank." "Is Morrison friendly with Voss?" The question settled on the table between them like a stone. "They play cards together," she said slowly. "Every other Thursday." Gideon's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes did. "So Voss walked into that bank knowing exactly what you brought in. He knew your note amount. He knew you were short. He's known all of it from the beginning." She said it without surprise because somewhere underneath the hoping and the calculating she had always known this, the way you always know the thing you're refusing to look at. "He's been watching the gap between what I have and what I owe since the note was written. Probably helped write the terms." "How much did James owe originally?" "The property note was $300. James paid $120 before he died. The remaining $180 somehow became $240 by the time I sat down with Morrison after the funeral. The silence this time was different, sharper. "Penalty fees," Gideon said, "restructuring charges. That's what Morrison called them. And you signed the new note." "I was 3 weeks out from burying my husband, and I had a ranch I didn't know how to run alone, and a banker telling me these were standard terms." Her voice was steady, but it was the steadiness of something that had been heated and hammered and was now very hard because of it. "Yes, I signed it." He didn't say "I'm sorry." He also didn't say "you should have known better," which was what 2 other men in her life had seen fit to offer. He just sat there with the facts in front of him, working through them. "We need $106 more in 9 days, he said. "I know." "All right." He pulled the piece of paper from his shirt pocket, the list from the morning, and smoothed it on the table. "Tell me about the Garrett brothers. Not Tom at the feed store. His brothers." She stared at him. "How do you know about the Garrett brothers?" "Tom mentioned them when I was in buying wire last week. Said they've got a house going up east of town, and they're behind on the framing because their builder quit over a payment dispute." He looked at her. "Payment dispute meaning they paid him half and stopped. So they're not reliable payers. They're also out a carpenter, and they're going to lose their window supplier contract if the frame isn't in before December 10th. He paused. "People become reliable payers when the alternative is worse than paying." "You'd work for them knowing that?" "I'd work for them with a contract that has a lien clause on the materials if payment doesn't clear." He tapped the pencil on the table once. "It's not foolproof, but it's the fastest money available in this county right now." She looked at him across the table. The lamp between them was burning low, and neither of them had noticed. "You've thought about this a lot," she said. "I've been thinking about it since Friday." Since Voss rode out through the gate. "You deserve to keep this ranch, Clara. That's not sentiment. It's just that he manufactured this situation, and I don't like watching manufactured situations succeed." She was quiet for a moment. "You don't even know me." "I know enough." "What do you know?" He looked at her steadily. "I know you got up every morning for 14 months and ran this place alone and didn't sell. I know you gave a stranger work and a bed without knowing anything about him. I know you said so am I, instead of, I'm fine when I asked about the fence, and that's the most honest thing I've heard a person say in 2 years. She held his gaze for a moment longer than she meant to. "That's not very much to know about a person," she said. "No," he agreed, "but it's the right things." She reached across the table and took the $12 and put it in the account book and closed it. "You'll go see the Garrett brothers tomorrow," she said. "In the morning. Take the wagon. The east road gets soft after rain, and it rained last night." "All right." She pushed back from the table and carried the lamp toward the hallway. At the doorway, she stopped. "Gideon?" He looked up. "For what it's worth," she said, "I know the right things about you, too." She went to bed before he could answer, which was deliberate, because she wasn't entirely sure what answer she was hoping for, and she had enough uncertainty in her life at the moment without adding to it. The Garrett brothers were exactly as advertised. Dean Garrett was 40 and loud, the kind of loud that substituted for confidence without actually being it. His brother Roy was quieter and smarter, which made him more dangerous because he was the one who actually read the contracts. They met Gideon at the building site, a shell of a frame, maybe a third of the way up, standing in a field like something abandoned mid-thought. It was good lumber, Gideon noted. Whoever had started this had decent materials to work with. "How fast can you finish the frame?" Dean said, walking the site like a man who knew things about construction, which he did not. "What's your deadline for the window contract?" "December 10th, Roy said from behind his brother. Gideon did the math in his head. "I can have the frame complete by December 7th if the weather gives me 3 clear days in the next week." "The weather's not going to give you 3 clear days," Roy said. "Then I'll work in the bad ones and finish December 9th. Dean Garrett liked that answer. He had the expression of a man who enjoyed watching other people work in difficult conditions. "We were paying the last man $80 for the full frame," Dean said. "I charged $90, Gideon said. $45 on signing, $45 on completion." "That's not—" "The lien clause," Roy said quietly, looking at the contract Gideon had written out that morning in Clara's kitchen, in that careful hand before sunrise. He read it twice. "If we miss the completion payment, you hold the materials." "That's correct. The materials are already set in. And if payment doesn't clear, I'll pull what I can and sell it to cover the debt, and you can explain to your window supplier why the frame is half missing." He said it pleasantly. "But that's a worst case. I'd rather just build the house and get paid." Roy looked at his brother. Something passed between them. The fast, wordless communication of men who had argued in private about money long enough to have a shorthand for it. $45 on signing, Roy said. "Today," Gideon said. Roy pulled out his wallet. I was back at the ranch by mid-afternoon. Clara was in the kitchen garden, what was left of it, pulling the last dead tomato stakes out of the frozen ground. She looked up when she heard the wagon. He came across the yard and held out $45. She looked at it. She looked at him. She looked at it again. "The Garrett brothers," she said. "Roy Garrett specifically. He's the one who matters." She took the money. She stood there in the garden with dead plant stakes in one hand and $45 in the other, and did the arithmetic that she'd been doing for 3 months. And this time it came out different. 134 plus 45, she said. 179, plus the 40 from Prentice on Monday. 219. You need 21 more. $21. She looked at the dead garden. She looked at the barn. She looked at the fence that was now solid and straight along every line she could see from where she was standing. "I have a loom," she said. "James's mother left it to us. I never learned to use it, and it's been sitting in the back bedroom since we moved in. It's a good loom, old but solid." "Who buys looms around here?" "Married women," she said, "or their husbands, buying for them. There's a family in town, the Mosers. The wife mentioned wanting one last spring, and I know they have money because they just painted their house, which nobody does in November unless they have money to spare. Do you want to sell it? She thought about that honestly. It was James's mother's loom. It had sat in that back bedroom for 6 years without being used. Sentiment and $21 looked at each other across a long pause. Yes, she said. She sold it the next morning for $24 to Hannah Moser, who drove out to see it with her husband, who stood back and let his wife make the decision, which Clara noted approvingly. Hannah ran her hands along the frame with the reverence of a person touching something they've wanted for a long time. And Clara watched her and thought about James's mother, who had apparently felt the same way about it once, and felt something loosen quietly in her chest that had been wound tight for a while. $24. Better than 21. But Monday came cold and sharp. She drove to Prentice Mill in the morning, and Elias Prentice handed her $40 in an envelope without being asked twice, which told her he was a man who kept his word, which was rarer than it should have been. She stopped by the bank on the way home. Not to pay the note, that wasn't due until December 2nd, but she wanted Morrison to know she was coming. She wanted him to stop assuming. Benjamin Morrison was a soft man, not physically, but in the way that mattered more, the kind of soft that came from never having to be accountable to consequences that touched him personally. He sat behind his desk in his bank and looked at her over the rim of his glasses with an expression she recognized. Barely concealed pity, wrapped in professional courtesy. "Mrs. Whitlock," he said, "is there something I can—" "I'll be in on December 2nd to pay the note in full," she said. "I wanted you to know in advance." He blinked. "In full?" $240. "In full." She held his gaze. "Please make sure the appropriate documentation is ready." He recovered his composure in a way that was slightly too slow. "Of course. We'll have everything prepared." "Thank you," she said, and left. She sat in the wagon on the street outside the bank and allowed herself exactly 30 seconds of something that wasn't quite triumph, but lived close to it. Then she picked up the reins and drove home, because there was still work to do, and she was almost certain Morrison would be sending a message to Harold Voss before the day was out, and she wanted to be on her own land when whatever came next came. It came on Wednesday, not Voss this time. One of his men, a wide, quiet man named Steck, who Clara had seen before but never spoken to, rode up to the gate and stood there until Gideon came out of the barn and walked across the yard to meet him. She watched from the porch. She couldn't hear the conversation, but she could see Gideon's posture, which didn't change. Not a shift, not a tension, just the same steady arrangement of a man who was not planning to be moved by what he was hearing. Steck handed him an envelope and rode away. Gideon walked to the porch and held the envelope up to Clara. She took it and opened it. Inside was a single piece of paper with 2 lines on it. "The note has been acquired from First Territorial Bank. Payment is now due to Voss Land Trust. Terms are unchanged." She read it twice. The implications assembled themselves with cold, efficient cruelty. If Voss had bought the note from the bank, paying it off was no longer a transaction with an institution. It was a transaction with him. And if he chose not to accept payment, or claim procedural issues, or introduce new terms in the transfer paperwork, "Can he do that?" Gideon said. "I don't know." Her voice was flat. "I don't know if that's legal. I don't know if Morrison had the authority to sell it." She looked at the paper. "I don't know how much he paid Morrison for it." "Probably not much," Gideon said. "Morrison would have sold it cheap to get out from under whatever Voss had on him." She folded the paper and put it in her coat pocket. "I need a lawyer," she said. "Does this county have one worth talking to?" "There's a man in Caldwell, Nathaniel Cross. He handled James's estate. He's honest, which is unusual enough that people mention it specifically when they talk about him." "Can you get him out here?" "He doesn't come out to ranches. I'd have to go to him." "How far is Caldwell?" "Half a day by wagon. A day and a half round trip if I stay over." She looked at the sky. "I could leave tomorrow morning." "I'll keep things going here." She looked at him. Something about the plainness of it, "I'll keep things going here," caught somewhere in her chest and stayed there. "You're going to be at the Garrett place," she said. "I can do both." "Gideon?" "The framework is in sets. I can be there in the mornings and back here by mid-afternoon. The animals just need feeding. Nothing's going to collapse in 2 days." She looked at the folded paper in her pocket and then at the ranch. Her ranch, James's barn, the fence that was straight now, the gate that held, and she made the decision that she always made when she was scared, which was to keep moving. "I'll leave at first light," she said. He nodded. She went inside to pack what she needed for the trip, and he went back to the barn, and the wind came in off the northwest carrying the particular cold that meant the first real winter weather was building itself somewhere out there in the dark, waiting for the right moment. It was November 23rd, 9 days to December 2nd. The note was in hostile hands. The money was almost there. The man she'd hired to fix a fence was the only other person on earth who knew the full shape of what she was up against. She packed her bag that night and set it by the door and sat at the kitchen table one more time with the account book. And for the first time in a long time, the numbers didn't look like defeat. They looked like a fight she had not yet lost. That was enough. For tonight, that was enough. She left before the sky had fully decided to be morning. Gideon was already up. She could see the lamp burning in the bunkhouse when she came out to hitch the horse. And he came across the yard without being asked and helped her with the traces in the dark, working by feel more than sight, the way men do when they've done something enough times that their hands know it independently of their eyes. "The black heifer's been off her feed," Clara said, because she needed to say something practical or she was going to say something she hadn't figured out yet. "Just watch her. She probably just needs a day." "I'll watch her." The barn latch on the east door sticks. You have to lift and turn at the same time, or it won't. "Clara." She stopped. "I've been working on this ranch for 3 weeks," he said. "I know the latch." She pulled her coat tighter and climbed up to the wagon bench. The cold was the specific kind that made breathing feel like a small chore. "Cross's office is on Main Street in Caldwell," she said, "above the hardware store. If something happens, if Voss comes, or if nothing's going to happen that I can't handle for 2 days." She looked at him standing in the dark yard. The lamp from the bunkhouse threw just enough light to see his face, which was the same face it always was, steady, slightly worn at the edges, telling her nothing she hadn't already gathered. "All right," she said. She drove out through the gate and didn't look back, which was something James had told her once was the only way to leave a place you cared about. You looked back and the leaving got harder. You kept your eyes on the road, and you let the place hold itself until you returned. The road to Caldwell was flat and gray and cold, and gave her 6 hours alone with her thoughts, which was not the company she would have chosen. Nathaniel Cross was not what people expected when they expected a lawyer, which worked in his favor. He was thin and 50-ish and wore his coat like it had been purchased for someone with slightly different shoulders. And he had a habit of listening with his eyes half closed that made people think he wasn't paying attention until they realized, usually too late, that he'd retained every word they'd said down to the inflection. He listened to Clara for 12 minutes without interruption. Then he opened his eyes fully and said, "Show me the note." She'd brought the original, the one she'd signed after James died, with Morrison's looping signature at the bottom. Cross read it twice, turned it over and read the back, set it on his desk, and looked at it the way Gideon looked at fence lines before touching them. "The transfer notice," he said. She gave him Voss's letter. He read that once and set it beside the note. "Morrison sold this note to Voss Land Trust," he said, not as a question. "That's what the letter says." "Did Morrison send you any notice before the transfer? Written notice, formal notification that the note holder was changing?" She thought, "No." Cross's expression shifted slightly, not into satisfaction exactly, but into the look of a man who had just found the loose board. "Kansas statute requires 30 days written notice to the debtor before a promissory note can be transferred to a third party," he said. "If Morrison didn't send that notice, and it sounds like he didn't, because 30 days ago you still believed you were paying the bank, then the transfer is procedurally defective." "What does that mean for me?" "It means that as of this moment, your legal obligation for payment remains with First Territorial Bank, not with Voss Land Trust. Voss can't enforce collection. He can't set new terms. He can't foreclose." He paused. "It also means Morrison may have committed fraud, which is a separate problem that's his problem, not yours." Clara sat with this for a moment. Can Voss fix the procedure, reissue the notice correctly, and wait 30 more days? He could try. That would push your actual deadline to January. Cross picked up the original note and held it toward the window light. "But there's something else here I want to look at. The penalty fees Morrison assessed after your husband died. The adjustment from $180 to $240. He called them restructuring charges. Did you receive an itemized accounting of those charges before you signed? No, he put the new note in front of me and told me it was standard. Cross set the note down. He looked at her over the half-closed eyes. Clara, I think Benjamin Morrison has been operating considerably outside his authority for some time, and I think Harold Voss has been making that arrangement worth his while. He said it the way a doctor names a disease, not cruelly, just clearly. I can file an injunction today that prevents any collection action by Voss Land Trust until the procedural questions are resolved. That buys you time. How much time? 30 to 60 days minimum. Longer if the bank can't produce documentation for those penalty fees, which I suspect they can't. She felt something shift under the weight of the past 3 months, some load-bearing beam she'd been holding upright by herself, and felt it take some of its own weight for the first time. She didn't let herself lean into it. Not yet. What does this cost? She said. My retainer is $20. If we go to court, it's more, but I don't think it'll get to court. Men like Voss don't like courtrooms when the paperwork isn't on their side. Why not? Because courtrooms are public. He almost smiled. And public is the one thing Harold Voss has never liked. She paid him the $20. She spent that night at the boarding house above the dry goods store on the edge of town, in a room with a window that rattled in the wind and a mattress that had given up being comfortable sometime around 1871. And she lay there in the dark listening to the weather build outside and thought about Gideon alone on her ranch. She thought about the black heifer. She thought about the east barn latch. She thought about the way he'd stood in the dark yard that morning and said, I've been working on this ranch for 3 weeks, like it was something that meant something to him. She wasn't sure what to do with that, so she filed it away in the same place she filed other things she wasn't ready to look at yet, and eventually the wind and the fatigue won out, and she slept. She drove home the next afternoon through weather that had gone genuinely threatening. The sky was the color of an old bruise, and the wind was coming from the northwest with the kind of commitment that meant it had been building for days. By the time she turned onto her road, the temperature had dropped 15 degrees since morning, and the first hard pellets of sleet were ticking against the wagon boards. She was a mile from the ranch gate when she saw the smoke. Not the smoke from the house stove, which she knew the shape of. Different smoke. More of it. Rising from the direction of the barn, she stood up in the wagon bench, which was stupid and instinctive and accomplished nothing. Then she sat back down and pushed the horse faster than was wise on an icy road, and the horse, being a practical animal, took the instruction without argument. The barn was not on fire. She could see that when she came through the gate, the smoke was coming from outside the barn, from a burn barrel near the east wall that Gideon had evidently set up to deal with the old fence scrap lumber. The barn itself was solid and dark and had all its walls. She let out a breath. Gideon came around the side of the barn when he heard the wagon. He looked at her face. I saw the smoke, she said. Something passed through his expression, understanding, and something like apology that he hadn't thought about how it might look from the road. Fence lumber. I didn't think about the sightline. No, it's fine. She climbed down from the wagon. Her legs were less steady than she would have preferred. It's fine. He took the horse's bridle while she got herself organized, and she was grateful for the moment to put her face in order. How'd it go in Caldwell? He said. She told him, standing in the yard in the sleet that was getting more serious by the minute, condensing Nathaniel Cross and the statute and the procedural defect into the essential facts. He listened the same way Cross listened, fully, without interrupting. Injunctions filed, he said when she finished. Filed this morning before I left. Cross is sending a copy to Voss by messenger today. Gideon nodded slowly. He'll be furious. I know. Furious men do stupid things. I know that too. She looked toward the road, which was empty. The sleet ticked against everything. I want you to know I don't expect you to be in the middle of this. It's my fight. You've already done more than... Stop, he said. I'm just saying, Clara, stop. She stopped. He let go of the horse's bridle and looked at her straight on. I'm not going anywhere. I told you that. Stop trying to give me a graceful exit. She held his gaze for a moment. Why? It was a direct question, and she saw him feel it as such. A slight change in his posture, something bracing. Because I'm tired of exits, he said. He took the horse to the barn. She carried her bag inside and put on a pot of water and stood in her kitchen listening to the sleet and tried to figure out what exactly she was feeling, and came up with several things at once, none of which she was prepared to act on. The weather broke overnight into something worse. By morning, it was a proper storm, not the blizzard that would come later, but the kind of relentless, soaking, freezing rain that was in some ways harder to work in because it never gave you the clean drama of snow, just wet cold that worked its way into everything and made every task take twice as long and left you twice as tired. Gideon left for the Garrett place at first light. Clara worked the ranch, fed the animals, broke ice on the water troughs, checked the fence line for storm damage. One section of wire had come loose near the north corner, probably from the wind, and she fixed it herself with the tools she'd watched him use often enough to have learned the basics. It wasn't as clean as his work. It held. He came back in the afternoon with $45 from Roy Garrett, who had counted it out in exact bills without being asked, which told Gideon, and he told Clara, that Roy had prepared for this payment in advance, planned for it, which meant he'd taken the lien clause seriously. "The frame is done," Gideon said. He was soaked through to his shoulders, and his hands were red from the cold. "Window crew can start Monday." She put the $45 in the account book and did the final count. $243. 3 more than she needed. She sat there looking at it. "That's it," she said. "Yes." She closed the account book. It made a small final sound. She made him sit by the stove and brought him coffee and didn't make a thing of it, which he appreciated visibly in the way people appreciate things they don't know how to respond to, by saying nothing and just accepting them. They sat on opposite sides of the kitchen table and drank their coffee and listened to the rain on the roof, and it was one of those silences that wasn't empty. "There's something I should tell you," he said. She waited. "The reason I was walking the road when I found your ranch." He turned the coffee cup in his hands, not looking at her. "It wasn't just wandering. I mean, it was wandering, but there was a reason I left where I was." "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." He looked up. "I want to. I've been trying to figure out when for about a week." She set her cup down and gave him her full attention, which was the kind of attention that made people feel both seen and slightly exposed. "I was working in Hayes City," he said, 14 months ago. I was the lead carpenter on a commercial building, a 3-story warehouse for a grain trading company. New construction, good commission, more responsibility than I'd had before." He paused. "I had an apprentice, young man named Danny Pruitt, 19 years old from Salina, been with me about 8 months. Good instincts, worked hard." The rain ticked against the window. "We were at the 3rd floor framing stage. I'd calculated the load spans myself. That was my job. That was what I was trusted to do. And He stopped. His jaw worked for a moment. "I made an error in the calculation. Significant error. The kind that a more careful man would have caught before he started cutting lumber." He stopped again. She didn't say anything. "The floor gave way during assembly," he said. "Not the whole floor, 3 sections on the northwest corner. 2 men fell. One of them broke his leg in 2 places and his collarbone. The other one was Danny." The quiet in the room got heavier. "Danny broke his wrist and 3 ribs and spent 6 weeks unable to work. He recovered." Gideon said this like it was the most important fact in the sentence, because to him it was. "He recovered fully. But it was my calculation, my error, my responsibility. The building company paid the damages, and I paid back every cent of my commission, and then I left, because He turned the cup again. "Because every time I looked at Danny after that, I saw what I'd almost done, and I couldn't figure out how to stand in front of him and be his teacher anymore when I'd been the one who put him on a floor that wasn't safe." The rain. "So you left," Clara said. "I left." He finally looked at her. "And I've been on the road since then, taking work where it's simple enough that I don't have to do the calculations that matter. Post setting, rail splitting, work that doesn't carry weight." He looked at his hands. "Your barn roof was the first time I'd been above ground floor on anything since Hayes City." "I know," she said quietly. "I saw you on the peak." He nodded. He'd known she'd seen. "I've been avoiding the thing that happened by staying small, and I knew I was doing it, and I kept doing it anyway, because..." He seemed to run out of words briefly. Because being wrong about something that puts people in danger is a particular kind of wrong. It doesn't go away by ignoring it. No, she said, it doesn't. He looked at her. You're not surprised. By what? By any of it. She considered this. You move like someone who used to trust themselves and then stopped. I noticed it early. She picked up her coffee cup. I've been waiting for you to tell me what it was. He was quiet for a moment. Does it change anything? For me? She seemed genuinely puzzled by the question. No, why would it? Because I was responsible for people getting hurt. You made a calculation error and it cost you everything, and you've been punishing yourself for 14 months, she said. That's not the same as being a man who doesn't care about responsibility. That's the opposite problem. She set the cup down. The man who doesn't feel it is the dangerous one. You clearly feel it. You've been feeling it every day. He looked at her in the way of someone who has braced for a verdict for a long time and is having difficulty adjusting to the actual outcome. Danny Pruitt, she said, you never went back to see how he was. No. Why? He opened his mouth and closed it. Then, because I was afraid of what he'd say. Or afraid of what he wouldn't say, she said gently. That he'd be fine. That he'd moved on. That the thing you've been carrying like a millstone wasn't as catastrophic to him as it was to you. He said nothing for a long moment. The rain was letting up. She could hear it thinning on the roof. Both, he said finally. Probably both. She nodded. You should write to him. I know. Not for his sake necessarily, for yours. I know that too. He looked at the window. The rain had gone quiet. I just haven't been ready. Maybe get ready, she said. Not unkindly, just honestly. He nodded once. She refilled his coffee and they sat a while longer in the kitchen and didn't talk about it anymore, which was also its own kind of conversation. The kind that happens after something important has been said and allowed to exist without being analyzed to death. Harold Voss received Nathaniel Cross's injunction notice on a Thursday. Clara knew this not because anyone told her, but because Voss showed up at her gate on Friday morning with 4 men instead of 3, and this time he did not perform his usual ritual of unhurried confidence. He stopped at the gate, Gideon's repaired gate, solid on its rehung hinges, and he looked at the property with an expression she had never seen on his face before. He looked like a man doing arithmetic and not liking the numbers. Gideon was on the porch when Voss arrived. He hadn't been standing there waiting. He'd been replacing a board on the left side of the porch, the one that had gone soft and dark from water damage, in his hand, watching. Clara walked to the gate. She did not open it. Mr. Voss, she said. He looked at her from horseback. His jaw was set differently than usual, tighter, with less of the performance of ease. I received a document from a lawyer in Caldwell. I thought you might. You've been busy. I have, she said. I've been paying off a note that was illegally transferred without proper notification, working with a lawyer who's very interested in how it was transferred and counting money. She looked at him steadily. I'll be at the bank on December 2nd with $240. I'll be paying the original note holder, which is First Territorial Bank, because that's what the statute says I'm required to do. Morrison sold me that note legally. Nathaniel Cross believes otherwise, she said, and he's prepared to let a judge look at it, along with the penalty fees that were added to my note without itemization or authorization after my husband died. She paused. I imagine Morrison is less comfortable with that prospect than you are. Voss's horse shifted under him. He controlled it without looking down. This isn't over, he said. It might be closer to over than you expected, she said. Have a good morning, Mr. Voss. She turned and walked back to the porch. She heard his horse turn on the road. She heard 4 sets of hooves move away. She sat on the top porch step and her hands were shaking slightly, which she hated, and she pressed them flat on her knees until they stopped. Gideon set his hammer down and sat on the step beside her. Not close, just present. That was well done, he said. I was terrified. I know, it was still well done. She looked at her hands, which had settled. He'll find another angle. Men like him always find another angle. Probably, Gideon agreed. But every angle he tries from here costs him time and legal fees and the possibility of a judge looking at how he conducts business. He picked up the hammer again. Exposure is expensive for men like Voss. Eventually the property isn't worth the exposure. She looked at him sideways. You sound like a lawyer. I've dealt with men like Voss before, he said. Different name, same arithmetic. She wanted to ask about that. It was clearly a story, something from before the road, before Hayes City. But she could hear in how he said it that it wasn't a story for today. She filed it alongside the other things and let him go back to the porch board. The hammer blows were steady and even, like a clock that knew what it was doing. Boom. The days between then and December 2nd had a different quality than the days before. The siege feeling didn't leave entirely, but it changed character, from the particular dread of a deadline approaching to the more manageable tension of waiting for something you'd done everything you could to prepare for. Gideon finished the porch. Both sides, the full length of it, new boards cut clean and set level, the way the original builder had probably intended before the Kansas winters had their opinion about it. He didn't ask permission, and he didn't present it as anything special. He just did it, the way he did everything, because it needed doing, and he was there. Clara watched him work on it from the kitchen window one morning while she was washing the breakfast dishes, and found herself thinking about something James had said once, early in their marriage, when she'd asked him how he'd known she was the right woman to marry. He'd said, "You didn't need to be taken care of. You needed someone to work next to." And she'd laughed and told him that was a peculiar compliment, and he'd said he meant it as the highest kind. She thought about that now, watching Gideon set a board with the focused attention of someone who gave the same care to what no one would see as to what everyone would. And she thought, carefully, without hurrying it, that some things you recognized not when they announced themselves, but when you noticed you'd already been relying on them for a while without realizing it. She washed the last dish and put it away, and didn't pursue the thought further. There was still December 2nd to get through. On the evening of December 1st, she counted the money one more time, not because she needed to, she knew the number, but because there was something in the physical act of counting that made it real in a way that numbers in a book didn't quite accomplish. $243 on the kitchen table. Gideon sat across from her and watched her count without making any comment about the fact that she was counting money she'd already counted twice. When she finished, she looked up. "Come with me tomorrow." He had been expecting her to say something, but not quite that. "To the bank?" "Yes." She put the money back in the envelope. "I want a witness. Someone who isn't connected to Morrison or Voss or any of it." "All right." "Also," she said, and then paused, which was unusual for her, because she was not a woman who paused often before saying things. "I'd just rather not do it alone, if that's honest." He looked at her across the table, and the lamp between them was burning the same as it always burned, and nothing in the room was different than it had been any other evening, and yet something had shifted in the way a room shifts when a window is opened somewhere and the air changes without you seeing the window. "That's honest," he said. She nodded and put the envelope in the account book and closed it. 7 o'clock, she said. "I'll have the horse ready at 6:30. She went to bed, and he walked back across the yard to the bunkhouse in the dark, and the temperature was dropping again, and somewhere to the northwest, in the direction that always delivered the worst weather to this particular valley. The clouds were building into something that had been assembling itself for days, patient and indifferent and very large, waiting for the right moment with the absolute certainty of things that don't need to hurry because they're going to happen regardless. December 2nd was 18 hours away. The money was counted. The lawyer was on their side. The fence was solid. It should have felt like enough. She lay awake for a long time, listening to the wind and wondering why it didn't quite feel like enough yet. And eventually she identified the reason, which was that Voss was still out there, and men like Voss did not accept losing gracefully, and tomorrow was not over until it was over. She was right about that. She just didn't know yet what form it would take, or what it would cost, or what it would require of a man who had spent 14 months trying very hard to stay small and was about to discover that he had, quietly and without planning it, become something larger than that again. They left at 6:40 in the morning with the envelope inside Clara's coat and the sky doing nothing reassuring. The clouds to the northwest that she'd heard building all night had moved closer in the dark and were now sitting directly overhead in a solid gray mass that had the particular density of weather that has made a decision. The temperature had dropped another 10 degrees since midnight. The horse moved with the stiff, reluctant gait of an animal that would have preferred to stay in the barn and had opinions about the humans who disagreed. Neither Clara nor Gideon said much on the road. The silence was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who had already said what needed saying and were now in the part of the thing where saying more wouldn't help. The envelope was in her coat. The money was counted. Cross's injunction was filed. Everything that could be prepared had been prepared. What couldn't be prepared for was the wagon sitting outside the bank when they arrived. Not just any wagon. A heavy freight wagon with Voss Land Trust stenciled on the sideboard in black letters, and two men sitting on the bench who straightened up when Clara and Gideon pulled in. Steck was one of them, the wide, quiet one who'd delivered the transfer notice. The other man Gideon didn't recognize. Clara looked at the wagon. She looked at the bank door. "He's already inside," she said. "Probably been here since it opened." Gideon set the brake on their wagon. "It doesn't change anything." "I know that." She said it firmly, like she was telling herself as much as him. They went in. The bank was a narrow room with a teller's cage on the right and a manager's office behind a glass partition on the left, and Benjamin Morrison was standing in the doorway of that office looking like a man caught between two directions he equally didn't want to go. Harold Voss was sitting in the chair across from Morrison's desk with his hat on, which was his signature form of contempt, and he turned when he heard the door, and his expression did what it always did when he looked at Clara, that slight rearrangement into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Mrs. Whitlock," he said, "early morning." "Mr. Voss." She walked past him to the teller's window as if he were furniture. "Good morning, Arthur." Arthur Binns, the teller, was 24 years old and had worked at this bank for 3 years and had the expression of a man who had been dreading this specific morning and was now living through it with the grim resignation of someone who has accepted that the day is going to be bad and has stopped hoping otherwise. "Mrs. Whitlock," he said, "I'm here to pay my note." She took the envelope from her coat and set it on the counter. $240 payable to First Territorial Bank. I'd like a receipt, a satisfaction of note, and the original document returned to me, please. She said it the way Cross had told her to say it. Word for word. She'd practiced it twice in the wagon on the road over, and Gideon had listened and told her it was right. Arthur looked at the envelope. He looked at Morrison. Morrison looked at Voss. Voss stood up. "Arthur," he said, and something in his voice had the weight of a man who had conversations with Morrison about exactly this moment. "That note is now the property of Voss Land Trust. Any payment made here cannot be applied. Mr. Voss." Nathaniel Cross stepped out of the teller's cage area, where he had been standing in the back corner so quietly that Gideon had not seen him when they came in. He had a leather satchel under his arm, and his coat was the same badly fitted one from Caldwell, and he looked, at 6:40 in the morning in a hostile bank, entirely unrattled. The injunction filed with the county court on November 26th specifically prohibits any enforcement action by Voss Land Trust on this note until the procedural questions regarding its transfer are resolved. Mrs. Whitlock is paying the original note holder as required by the original instrument. Arthur, please process this payment. Arthur looked at the envelope with the expression of a man who wished he had chosen a different profession, then reached through the window and took it. Voss's face went through several things quickly. The performance of ease collapsed first. Underneath it was the real face. Not rage, which Clara had half expected, but something colder and more calculated. He was thinking. She could see him thinking, which was more frightening than anger would have been. "Morrison," he said quietly. Morrison had gone pale. He was a soft man being asked to do something hard, and it showed in every part of him. "Harold, the injunction is, Cross has filed." "I am aware of what Cross has filed," Voss said, still quiet. "I'm asking you what the bank's position is." Morrison opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "The bank's position," Cross said, before Morrison could find whatever he was looking for, "is that this is a valid payment on a valid note, and the bank is required to accept it. Anything else exposes First Territorial to liability for obstructing a lawful debt settlement." He looked at Morrison directly. "Benjamin, you know this is right." Something happened in Morrison's face, a small collapse, like a wall that had been weakened for a long time and finally found a crack it could move through. He nodded. "Process it, Arthur." Arthur processed it. Voss stood in the middle of the room and watched, and the thing Clara had expected, the fury, the threat, the final bid at intimidation, did not come. Instead, he put on his hat, adjusted it with one hand, and walked toward the door. At the door he paused. He looked at Gideon. Not at Clara. At Gideon, which was its own kind of communication. "You're the carpenter," he said. Gideon said nothing. "You've done decent work on her property." Voss said it like a concession dragged out of him. "If you're looking for your next position after this arrangement concludes, my office in town is always looking for skilled men." It was a masterpiece of its kind, Clara thought. A threat and an offer and a diminishment all packed into 4 sentences. The offer told Gideon his arrangement with her was temporary. The threat told him that Voss had noted his involvement. The diminishment was just to remind everyone in the room who held the larger position. Gideon looked at him with the face of a man who has been spoken to like that before and has a collection of responses for it. "I appreciate the offer," he said. "No." Voss nodded once, like he'd expected that answer, and filed it somewhere useful, and walked out. The door closed behind him with a perfectly ordinary sound. The room exhaled. Arthur finished writing out the receipt with a hand that wasn't entirely steady. He passed it through the window with the original note and a satisfaction document that cross-checked twice before he let Clara sign anything. She signed it. Her hand was steady, which cost her something, but it was steady. She took the original note and held it for a moment. It was a piece of paper that had weighed more than paper had any right to weigh for 14 months. She folded it and put it in her coat pocket next to where the envelope had been. And she thanked Arthur, who deserved thanking, because being the man in the cage in that room had not been easy for him. And she shook Cross's hand and told him she'd have his remaining fees to him by the end of the month. She walked out of the bank into the cold air and the threatening sky and the wagon with Steck and the other man still on the bench, watching her with the blank expression of men who took their cues from someone who had just ridden away. She walked past them to her wagon. Gideon was right behind her. They were a quarter-mile down the road before either of them spoke. "It's done," she said. It came out quieter than she'd intended, like something said to herself as much as to him. "It's done," he agreed. She let out a breath she felt like she'd been holding for 3 months. It made a small cloud in the cold air and disappeared. "He's not finished," she said. "He'll find something else." "Maybe," Gideon said, "but it won't be the note. And Cross knows the pattern now. Voss loses his advantage when someone's watching the methodology." She thought about Voss's face in the bank, the calculation, the offer to Gideon. "He tried to recruit you." "I noticed." "What would you have said 6 weeks ago, if he'd offered you work before you came here?" Gideon considered this with the honesty she'd come to expect from him, which meant he actually thought about it, rather than giving her the comfortable answer. "Probably still no," he said. "I don't work well for men who smile at women the way he smiles at you. That's a specific criterion. I found it useful." The first snow started about 10 minutes outside of town. Not sleet this time. Actual snow, light and dry. The kind that was pretty for approximately 3 minutes before you remembered what it meant about the temperature. Clara watched it settle on the horse's mane and on Gideon's shoulders and on the road ahead of them turning white, and she felt the particular combination of relief and fear that comes when one fight ends and you understand immediately that the world has not restructured itself to give you a break before the next one. She was right to be afraid of the snow. She just didn't yet understand why. They got home to find the barn latch had failed. Not the east door latch, which stuck and needed the lift and turn. That one had held fine. The main barn door, the large one on the south face, had taken a gust of wind while they were gone, and the latch mechanism, which had been working on borrowed time since September, had finally given out, and the door had swung open and been driven back against the barn wall, and the livestock had been left to the December cold for somewhere between 2 and 4 hours. The cattle were fine. Cold and unhappy, but fine. The 2 draft horses were in the back stalls and had stayed put. The black heifer, the one that had been off her feed, was in the corner of her stall with her ears back and her breathing slightly wrong. Gideon saw it first. He crouched next to her without speaking and ran his hands along her sides and checked her eyes and her gums and her breathing with the focused attention of someone who'd been around animals long enough to know the difference between cold unhappy and actually wrong. "How long has she been breathing like that?" he said. "I don't know. I didn't check her this morning before we left." Clara was crouching on the other side. She was just off her feed. "This isn't from the door being open." He stood up. This was already starting. The cold made it worse. He looked at Clara. "You have a vet in town?" "Caldwell's vet is half a day away. The closest is Ed Marsh, 2 farms over, but he handles horses mostly. Get him anyway. He was already moving to the stall door. I'll stay with her. Go now, before the snow gets worse. She went. She pushed the horse harder than she liked on a road that was getting slippery, and she got Ed Marsh out of his supper and back to her barn in 40 minutes, which was fast. And Ed looked at the heifer with the practiced economy of a man who had delivered more bad news about animals than he'd liked. Respiratory, he said. Started before the cold. The cold set it moving faster. He looked at Clara. I've seen this resolve. I've seen it not resolve. Could go either way over the next 24 hours. What does she need? Warm and dry and watched. He gave them a small bottle of something from his bag, half a measure in her water twice a day. Keep the stall bedded deep. If her breathing gets worse, more labored, you'll hear it. Come get me again. He rode back in the snow, and Clara and Gideon set up a watch rotation without discussing it. She'd take the first 4 hours, he'd take the middle of the night, she'd be back by 4 in the morning. It was practical, and it was what needed doing, and neither of them made it into anything more than that. She sat in the barn in the lantern light with the heifer and listened to the snow hit the roof and thought about the satisfaction document in her coat pocket, and the way the day had started and the way it had gone sideways at the end, which was the ranch's preferred pattern. Give you a victory, and then immediately make sure you couldn't get comfortable about it. At 11 o'clock, she went and knocked on the bunkhouse door and Gideon took over, and she went inside and slept harder than she'd slept in weeks, which was what relief did when it was allowed to. The heifer improved by morning, not dramatically. She was still breathing harder than she should, and she still wasn't interested in her feed, but the labored quality Ed had warned about wasn't there, and by afternoon she was accepting water and standing with less of the hunched shoulder posture of an animal in serious distress. Gideon had been with her through the coldest hours of the night, and had the look of a man who'd slept approximately 90 minutes in a barn, which was to say he looked like himself but at slightly reduced resolution. He ate breakfast in concentrated silence and went back to the barn to check her again, and Clara watched him go and thought about what it meant that the most reliable person on her property was a man who'd arrived 6 weeks ago with 43 cents in a tool bag and a past he'd been running from. The snow kept coming. Not a blizzard, not yet, just the steady, patient accumulation of a storm that was taking its time, the way the worst ones always did. She got a letter on the 3rd of December. It came with the weekly mail delivery from town. A boy named Pete Callahan who made the rural rounds on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and who handed her the letter with the specific expression of a 14-year-old who had been told to make sure she got it personally, which meant someone had paid extra for the instruction. The return address was an attorney's office in Wichita, not Cross, someone she'd never heard of. The letterhead said Beaumont and Associates, and the letter inside was 2 pages of dense legal language that took her 3 readings to understand. When she understood it, she sat down on the porch step in the cold without feeling the cold. Voss had filed a civil action claiming that the original transfer of the note was legally valid, and that her payment to First Territorial was therefore invalid, and that the property stood in breach of the now Voss-held instrument. He was suing her to undo the payment she'd just made. She read it a 4th time, looking for the part where it was not as bad as it seemed. She didn't find that part. She was still sitting on the porch step when Gideon came around the side of the barn and saw her and came over. She handed him the letter without saying anything. He read it. He read it again. He folded it carefully along its original creases and handed it back. Cross, he said. Yes. Today. Yes. She stood up. I need to go back to Caldwell. I know. She looked at him. He was standing in the snow in his work coat with his hands in his pockets, and he looked tired. Not broken, not defeated, just tired in the way of someone who has been fighting alongside someone for long enough that the other person's exhaustion has become their own. This could go on for a long time, she said. If he takes this to court, it could drag out for months, more. She was telling him something with this, not just about the legal situation. She was telling him that she understood if this changed his calculation. He looked at her steadily. Do you have enough to pay Cross's court fees if it comes to that? Barely. The harvest money is gone to the note. I have what's left of the wages account and what I'll bring in over winter. The Garrett brothers want me to look at their interior framing after the holidays. Roy mentioned it yesterday when I picked up the final payment. He said it matter-of-factly, like he was discussing a fence repair. That's another $40, maybe $50. She looked at him. You're already planning work for after the holidays. I'm planning work for after the holidays, he agreed with the same inflection, which told her it was not accidental. She didn't push it. She went inside and got her coat and her purse and the letter and came back out to find he'd already hitched the wagon. She looked at the wagon. She looked at him. You don't need to come every time. I know. He climbed up to the bench. I'm coming anyway. She got in, and they went, and the snow came down around the wagon in the particular quiet of snowfall, and somewhere behind them the black heifer was in her warm stall, breathing steadier than yesterday, which was not nothing. Cross read the Beaumont and Associates letter with the same half-closed eyes and the same unrattled attention, and then he set it on his desk and said, "This is aggressive." "Yes," Clara said. "It's also not as strong as it looks." He tapped the letter with one finger. "They're challenging the procedural validity of your payment, but to do that, they have to simultaneously argue the transfer was valid, which means they have to produce documentation for a 30-day notice that doesn't exist." He looked at her. "They're betting you'll look at this and decide the fight isn't worth it." "It is worth it." "I know it is." He opened a drawer and took out a legal pad. "Here's what we do. I file a response that does two things. First, it challenges the factual basis of their claim. No notice, no valid transfer, payment to original holder stands. Second, it countersues for the unauthorized penalty fees Morrison added to your note after your husband's death." He looked up. "If I can prove those fees were manufactured, and I believe I can, because banks are required to document these things, and documentation that doesn't exist is very loud. We're not just defending a lawsuit, we're on offense." Something shifted in the weight of the room. "On offense," she repeated. "Morrison falsified your note," Cross said plainly. "That's bank fraud. That involves Voss Land Trust, which means Voss is exposed. Men who've built land empires on manufactured legal instruments do not want a judge examining their methodology." He picked up his pen. "I'm going to send Beaumont and Associates a response that makes very clear what we intend to demonstrate in court, and I believe strongly that within 2 weeks Harold Voss will decide this particular ranch is not worth the examination." She sat quietly for a moment. "You've seen this before," she said. "Variations of it." "Yes." He said it without pride. "The frontier is full of men who built their holdings by leaning on widows and farmers who didn't have lawyers. Most of them have been doing it long enough that they've stopped worrying about someone pushing back." He paused. "They're always surprised when someone does." She looked at Gideon, who was sitting in the chair to her left and had been quiet throughout, in the way he was quiet when he was listening to everything. He caught her look. "He's right," Gideon said simply. She turned back to Cross. "Do it." She was quiet most of the way back. The snow had stopped while they were in Cross's office, which was not comfort exactly, but was at least a cessation of active problems. The road was white, and the late afternoon light was thin, and she drove with the reins loose in her hands, which meant she was thinking rather than paying attention, and the horse, who knew the road home, did not require much guidance. "He's set on offense," she said, about 3 miles out. "I heard him. I've been fighting defensively for 14 months. She said it like something she'd only just articulated to herself. "Everything I've done, the fence, the cattle fee, the prentice job, the lawyer, it's all been trying to stay where I am. Staying where you are against someone trying to push you off is not nothing. No, but it's different from actually pushing back." She was quiet for a moment. "If Cross files the counterclaim and it works, if Voss really does back off because the exposure is too much, then it's over. Truly over. And if it goes to court, then it goes to court." She said it with a steadiness that had not been there 2 months ago. It wasn't bravado. It was something more durable than bravado. The voice of a person who has tested themselves and found, with some surprise, that they didn't break. "I'll be there." He looked at her profile against the winter sky. "Yes," he said quietly, "you will." She glanced at him. Something in the way he said it, not cheerleading, not encouragement exactly, just a simple factual acknowledgement of something he'd observed to be true about her, settled somewhere in her chest with the particular warmth of being known accurately. She looked back at the road. "The heifer's going to be all right," she said. "Probably. You sat with her half the night. I was already awake. Gideon, Clara. She almost smiled. Thank you, that's all I'm saying, thank you. You're welcome, he said. That's all I'm saying, but the response from Beaumont and Associates came 8 days later. Cross forwarded it to her with a note attached in his careful handwriting that said only, as anticipated. The letter from Beaumont and Associates was 2 sentences long. It informed them that Voss Land Trust was withdrawing its civil action and would not be pursuing further legal remedies regarding the Whitlock property note. She read it standing in the kitchen. She read it twice, because 2 sentences needed reading twice to be believed. Then she set it on the table and sat down. She thought about Harold Voss, about the way he'd smiled the first time he came to her gate, about the way that smile had assumed she was already finished, that the gap between what she had and what she owed was already decided in his favor, that she was a woman alone on a piece of land she couldn't hold, and that he was a patient man who could wait for the inevitable. She thought about James building the barn with his brother and saying he could see where it would go before anything was there. She thought about what James would have said about the past 2 months, and she thought he would have had opinions about all of it, and she thought she would have argued with him about half of those opinions, and she thought that was exactly right, and it hurt in the specific way that things hurt when they're true. She heard the barn door open and close. Gideon, doing the midday check on the animals. The heifer had been eating normally for 4 days now, which Ed Marsh had confirmed was full recovery when he stopped by on his rounds. The door opened and Gideon came in, and he stopped when he saw her face. Good or bad, he said. She slid the letter across the table. He read it, he set it back down. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat, and he didn't say anything for a moment. That's it then, he said. That's it. He nodded slowly. The kitchen was warm from the stove. Outside, the December cold was doing what December cold in Kansas did, which was make everything look clean and permanent, the snow on the fence rails and the barn roof, and the fields where the wheat would go again in spring. I need to write a letter, he said. She looked at him. Danny Pruitt, he said in Selena. He said it the way you say a thing you've been deciding to say for a while. I've been ready for a few days. I just kept finding reasons to wait. There's no more waiting in this house, she said. I seem to have run out of reasons for it. He almost smiled at that. Do you have paper? She got him paper, and he sat at her kitchen table and wrote a letter that took him a long time, several drafts, and at least one complete start-over that he crumpled and set to the side with a controlled expression. She did not read what he wrote. She put the kettle on and made tea and set a cup beside him and went to do other things, because the letter was his business, and he needed space around it, not an audience. When he was done, he folded it and set it on top of the envelope and put his hands flat on the table, and she came back and looked at it. Ready? She said. No, he said. Send it anyway. She handed him the sealing wax. He sealed the letter and wrote Danny Pruitt's name on the front and his last known address in Selena, which he wrote from memory, and set it on the table where the outgoing mail sat for Pete Callahan's Thursday run. He sat back in the chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment, and she watched him and thought about what it cost a person to reach toward something they'd been flinching from for a year and a half, and thought it was not nothing, whatever the outcome. The east fence section, he said finally, looking back at her. The wire on the north corner that you repaired last week. You got the tension almost right. She blinked. Almost? If we get a hard freeze, it's going to pull at that splice. It needs another pass. I thought it was fine. It is fine for now. He stood up and carried his cup to the basin. It needs to be better than fine for winter. She looked at him with a feeling she could not have named precisely. Affection, she thought, was probably the most accurate word, though it felt insufficient. After supper, she said. After supper, he agreed. She put a pot on the stove and he went back to the barn to finish the afternoon checks, and the letter to Danny Pruitt sat on the table by the door, and the satisfaction document from First Territorial sat in the account book on the shelf, and the kitchen smelled like wood smoke and something cooking, and outside the Whitlock ranch held itself against the December cold the way it had been built to do, post by post and board by board, repaired and reinforced, and still standing. The letter to Danny Pruitt came back 3 weeks later. Not a returned letter, a reply. Pete Callahan handed it to Gideon directly on a Thursday morning in late December, with the particular lack of ceremony of a 14-year-old who delivered letters and did not consider their contents his business, which was the correct attitude, and Gideon appreciated it. He stood in the yard and looked at the envelope for a moment before he opened it. His name was written on the front in handwriting he recognized, Danny's, still the same slight leftward lean it had always had. The handwriting of someone who'd been told to hold the pen differently and never quite got around to it. He opened it. It was 2 pages. He read it standing in the cold, and Clara, who was coming out of the barn with the morning milk pail, saw him reading it and saw his face and set the pail down on the porch step and waited. He read it twice. Then he folded it and put it in his coat pocket and stood there for a moment with his hand still over the pocket. "Good or bad?" she said. She was using his own question back at him, and she said it gently. He looked up. "He's doing well," he said. "He's working for a building firm in Salina, framing and finish work." He paused. "He said he was glad I wrote." She waited because there was clearly more. "He said he never blamed me," Gideon said. It came out slightly unsteady, which she suspected cost him something to let her hear. "He said he knew it was an error and not carelessness, that there was a difference." He stopped. "He said he wished I'd come back, that he learned more working with me in 8 months than he'd learned anywhere else, and that he was sorry I left the way I did because he never got to tell me that." The yard was very quiet. The December cold held everything still. "He asked if I was doing all right," Gideon said. Clara picked up the milk pail. She carried it to the kitchen door and set it inside, and then she came back out and stood in front of him, and she looked at his face, the face that had been steadily worn down to something honest by the months and the work and the telling the truth about things, and she said, "Are you?" He looked at her, really looked, the way he hadn't let himself look at things for a long time, which was directly and without the buffer of being useful. "Getting there," he said. She nodded. "That's the right answer." She went back inside to start breakfast, and he stood in the yard a minute longer, and then he followed her in, and the letter stayed in his coat pocket for the rest of the day, like something he needed to keep close until he was fully sure it was real. Christmas came and went quietly. There was no family nearby for either of them, which was a fact they didn't discuss directly, and managed companionably enough by simply treating the day as a day with better food than usual. Clara made a proper dinner from the stores she'd been careful with, a roasted chicken, potatoes, a dried apple pie that came out better than she'd expected, and slightly worse than she'd hoped, which she told him plainly when she set it on the table. "The crust is tough on the left side," she said. "I lost track of it." He ate the left side first and told her it was fine, which was not entirely true, and she knew it and appreciated the effort anyway. They sat at the table after dinner longer than they usually did. The stove was warm and the lamp was burning, and outside the Kansas winter was doing what it did, which was make the world very flat and very white and very cold, and not particularly interested in what the people in the houses thought about it. "Tell me something about before," she said. He looked up. "Before the road," she said. "Before Hayes City. What were you like when you were, 20? What did you want?" He thought about it with the honesty that had become his default with her, which meant he actually thought about it. "I wanted to build something people would look at in 50 years, he said. "Not a fence. Something, a courthouse maybe, a bridge, something with a span to it." He turned his coffee cup. "My father was a carpenter. His father before him. Good men, both of them. But small work, practical work. I wanted something bigger. And then you got bigger work." "And then I got bigger work," he agreed. "And I found out that bigger work has bigger consequences when you get it wrong." "That's true of most things," she said. "Yes." He looked at her. "What did you want at 20? She laughed, which was a sound that had been appearing more frequently in the past few weeks and had a quality to it that suggested it had been stored somewhere unused for a while. "I wanted to not live in my mother's house anymore, mostly. She had opinions about everything I did, and she was right about half of them, which was the most irritating possible percentage." She paused. "James was the first person he didn't try to fix me. He just stood next to me and worked." She was quiet for a moment. "I didn't understand how rare that was until he was gone." Gideon looked at her across the table. "You've built something here that he would recognize," he said. "It's still the ranch he built the barn for. You didn't let it become something else." She held that for a moment. "No," she said quietly. "I didn't." The lamp burned. The stove ticked. Outside, the wind moved across the fields in the particular way of winter wind on flat land, unobstructed and indifferent. And inside the kitchen was warm, and two people who had arrived at this table from very different directions sat with their coffee and their quiet, and did not feel the need to fill it. January brought a thaw, which everyone in the county knew better than to trust, and then brought a cold snap that vindicated the skeptics, and then settled into the particular gray stubbornness of a Kansas winter that has decided to stay and is not interested in your opinion about it. Gideon wrote a second letter to Danny Pruitt in January. This one was shorter and less difficult to write, which he did not tell Clara, but which she inferred from the fact that he wrote it at the kitchen table in one sitting and did not crumple any drafts. She brought him coffee and did not ask to read it, and he sealed it and set it on the outgoing mail pile and went back to the barn repair he'd been working on, which was a section of the loft floor that had been unstable since before he arrived. He worked on the loft floor for 4 days. Clara heard him up there. The careful footsteps, the measuring, the long pauses that she'd learned meant he was looking at a problem from all angles before he committed to a solution. She heard, on the second day, the particular quality of silence that she associated with him being still when he shouldn't be still, and she went to the barn door and looked up. He was on the loft level, standing near the edge, and he was not frozen the way he'd been on the barn roof in November. He was just standing, looking at the floor, his hands at his sides, the way a man stands when he's telling himself something and making sure it takes. She watched him for a moment. Then she went back to what she'd been doing. He finished the loft floor on the 4th day. When he came in for supper, he sat down and said, "The loft will hold 200% of what it was built for." And then he ate his supper with the appetite of a man who had completed something that mattered beyond the physical fact of it. She didn't comment on the loft specifically. She said, "Good," and passed him the biscuits, and that was exactly the right amount to say. The letter from Nathaniel Cross arrived in the 3rd week of January. She'd been expecting something. Cross had told her he'd be in touch. But the letter was longer than she'd anticipated, and she read it twice at the kitchen table before she fully understood what it said. Benjamin Morrison had resigned from First Territorial Bank. The state banking authority, following Cross's formal complaint, had opened an inquiry into the penalty fee assessments on 3 accounts. Clara's among them, but not only hers. There were 2 other accounts where Morrison had made similar adjustments, both belonging to people in similar circumstances to Clara, a widow in the county's north end, and a farmer whose land adjoined Voss property on the east side. The inquiry was ongoing. Cross said it was unlikely to proceed to criminal charges. These things rarely did when the man involved resigned and made quiet restitution, but that the unauthorized fees on Clara's note would be formally voided, which meant the bank owed her $60. $60, which was the difference between $180, the real original remaining balance, and the $240 she had paid. She read that part 3 times. Then she went and got Gideon from the barn. He read the letter at the kitchen table with his coat still on, which was how she knew he'd come in quickly. He read to the end. He set it down. $60, he said, due to me by the bank within 30 days of the inquiry conclusion. She sat across from him. Cross thinks the inquiry will conclude by March. He looked at her steadily. How do you feel? It was not a question she was often asked, directly and simply like that, without the person already having an answer they were steering toward. She sat with it for a moment. I feel like I paid $240 for something that cost $180, she said. And I feel like Morrison sat behind that desk and looked me in the face 3 weeks after my husband died and handed me a document with $60 extra of fraud in it and told me it was standard. She paused. I feel like I should have known. You were 3 weeks out from burying James, Gideon said. And you were alone and he was in a position of authority and he used that. That's not your failure to know. That's his decision to lie. She had told herself something similar, in various forms, over the past several months. Hearing it from someone else in a plain, undecorated sentence was a different thing from telling it to yourself. She noticed that. The other 2 accounts, she said, but the widow and the farmer. Cross is representing them? He mentioned he'd been in contact. She tapped the letter. I'd like to know they're all right. You could write to Cross and ask. I'll do that. She looked at the letter one more time. $60 in March. What are you going to do with it? She thought about this. The South Field needs drainage work before planting season. I've been putting it off because there wasn't money. She looked up. And I'd like to give you what I owe you, The $12 you put in, and the back wages I've been shorting you since November. He shook his head. The $12 was a loan. You said I could repay it in spring wages. It's nearly spring. She said it with the tone that ended negotiations, which he had learned was a real tone she had and was not worth arguing past. I'll pay the back wages and the loan in February when Cross sends the first accounting and the drainage work when the 60 comes through. He looked at her. The Southfield drainage is going to be a significant project. I know. It'll need more than one person. I know that too. She stood up to put the letter in the account book, where the other important documents lived. Are you saying you'd like to do it, or are you telling me it requires a crew? I'm saying I'd like to do it, and it might need one additional person for about a week, and I think Orville Henderson's youngest son is looking for work because Orville mentioned it when I returned his fence stapler last week. She stopped by the shelf and looked at him. When did you borrow Orville Henderson's fence stapler? Last month, for the north corner repair. He was completely calm about this. I brought it back with a jar of your honey because you'd mentioned you had extra, and Orville mentioned his son. I didn't make any promises. She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back. You've been planning ahead, she said. Seems reasonable, he said. She turned back to the shelf and put the letter away. The account book had gotten noticeably fuller over the past 3 months. Receipts, documents, Cross's letters, the satisfaction of note, the bank inquiry notice. A paper record of a fight that had been conducted one day at a time, mostly without certainty, with more fear than she'd admitted to anyone. She ran her fingers across the cover of the book. It's going to be a good year, she said. Not wishfully, as a statement of intention. Yes, he said. It is. February came in cold and left cold, which was February's prerogative, and in the middle of it 2 things happened within the same week. The first was that Orville Henderson came over for the fence stapler that Gideon had already returned, which meant what he actually wanted was to talk. He stood in the yard with his hat in his hands. He always took his hat off on her property now, something that had changed without announcement sometime in December. And he said, somewhat to the left of her shoulder, that he'd heard about the bank situation, and he was sorry it had taken him as long as it had to come say so. Come say what? She said. That James was a good man, and he'd have found a way through this, and I should have offered more help, and I didn't. He turned the hat in his hands. Eleanor said I should have come in the fall, when it was bad. She was right. She usually is. Clara looked at him for a moment. Orville Henderson was not a man built for apology. She could see the effort it was costing him just in the set of his shoulders. Thank you, Orville, she said. It's done now. Yes, well. He cleared his throat. Gideon tells me you might need someone for the drainage project in spring. My hired man talks too much, she said. My boy Clem needs work. He put his hat back on, apparently deciding the formal part was over. He's not as strong as he thinks he is, but he's not useless. I'd say 2/3 wages until he proves himself. I'll talk to Gideon about it, she said. We'll let you know. After Orville left, she found Gideon splitting wood behind the barn and told him what had been said, and he kept splitting wood and said, without stopping, Clem's fine. Orville undersells him. Have you met Clem? Briefly, in November. He helped me get the south gate off the road when my wagon wheel stuck. Good instincts, a bit reckless, can be taught. She watched him split a log with the efficiency of someone who had done physical work long enough that it didn't require thought. You've been assembling a crew, she said. He set the next log on the block. I've been paying attention to who's around and what they can do. He looked at her. Is that a problem? No, she said. It's not. The second thing that happened that week was smaller and said less but meant more. She found him on a Thursday evening at the kitchen table with a piece of paper and a technical drawing taking shape under his pencil, something with dimensions and angles and load calculations written in the margins in the small, precise hand that she now associated with his serious thinking. What is that? She said. He turned the paper so she could see it. The northwest corner of the barn, he said. The foundation's not wrong, but it's not as solid as it could be. I want to reinforce it before the spring thaw puts pressure on the soil. He pointed to the margin calculations. If I'm right about the load distribution, the reinforcement work would also let you add a second-level storage section above the northwest stall without worrying about the floor. She looked at the drawing. It was detailed and careful, and she recognized this now, having seen it in different forms for several months. It was the work of a man who had stopped staying small. "You checked the load calculations," she said. "3 times," he said quietly. "Then I checked them again." She understood what that meant. Not the engineering of it. The other thing. "Good," she said. "Show me where the reinforcement goes." He walked her through it. She asked questions. Some she knew the answers to, some she didn't, and he answered all of them with the same patience he gave to everything when it mattered. They stood over the drawing at the kitchen table for 20 minutes, and at the end of it she understood the project and she'd seen him explain something technical without flinching, without the shadow she'd watched cross his face for months whenever the work got complicated. He was not healed exactly. She didn't believe in healed exactly. She believed in the daily decision to show up and keep building, which was different from healed and more durable. But he was something. He was present in a way that he hadn't been in November, standing on the road with a tool bag and $2 and a past he was dragging like an anchor. "Start in March," she said, "after the drainage project." He folded the drawing and put it in his shirt pocket. "Probably April." She put the kettle on and he stayed at the table and they planned into the evening. And it was the most ordinary thing, the kind of ordinary that you spend years constructing without knowing that's what you're doing. The money from the bank came on the 12th of March. Cross's letter accompanied it. A formal accounting, the voided fees, the $60 restitution check drawn on First Territorial, which had a new manager now, a woman from Wichita named Adelia Marsh, who had come in with the stated intention of rebuilding the bank's credibility with the county, which was an ambition that Nathaniel Cross described in a separate note as both admirable and overdue. Clara held the check for a moment and then went and put it in the account book and did not make a ceremony of it. It was money she was owed. Having it returned was not a gift, it was a correction, and there was a difference. She did, however, allow herself a glass of the good whiskey she kept for occasions. One glass, at the kitchen table, by herself. In the afternoon before Gideon came in from the drainage project, which was on its 3rd day and was proceeding according to plan, except for a gravel layer. They hadn't anticipated that had required one design adjustment, and had not required, she'd noted, any of the paralysis that used to precede Gideon's design decisions. She sat with her glass and her account book and the March light coming through the kitchen window, and she thought about October, and about the gate hanging on one hinge, and about a man walking up the road with a tool bag, and about the way she had looked at the broken fence and said what she said without really planning to say it. "So am I. Fix whichever one you can." She had not meant it as an invitation. She had not meant it as anything, particularly. It had just come out of her the truth of where she was, said to a stranger because a stranger was there, and she was tired of performing fine. She had not expected it to be the sentence that changed things. She had not known that sentences could do that. She finished her glass and washed it and put it away. Gideon asked her to marry him in April. Not with elaborate preparation or a planned speech. She would not have wanted those things, and he knew enough about her by that point to know it. He asked her on a Tuesday morning when they were both already outside, already in their work clothes, already oriented toward the day's tasks, which was probably the most honest setting for a question about a life. He had been looking at the barn foundation reinforcement. He'd finished the week before, standing back from it at a distance to check the sightlines the way he always did when he'd finished something structural. And she was walking past him to the chicken coop with the feed bucket, and he turned and said without preamble, "Clara, I want to stay." She stopped walking. "You've been staying." "Permanently," he said. "I want to stay permanently, if you'll have me." He paused. "As your husband, if that's what you want." She stood there with the feed bucket. The chickens inside the coop were making their impatient morning sounds. The April light was the particular clear gold of a Kansas spring morning, which was the most generous thing the Kansas sky did all year, and it did it for about 3 weeks and then reverted. She looked at him. He was standing in the morning light with his hands at his sides, and his expression was not performing confidence. He was nervous. She could see it, just underneath the surface, and she appreciated that he wasn't hiding it. "You're not doing this because life has gotten easy," she said. "No," he said. "Life is not easy. I don't think it gets easy. I think you just get better at working through the hard parts with someone." He looked at her steadily. "I'd like that someone to be you." She set the feed bucket down. She thought about what it meant to build a life with a person who was not finished being built himself. She thought about the calculations he checked 4 times now. About Danny Pruitt, who had written back twice more, and the last letter had said he was thinking of coming to visit in summer. And Gideon had read that at the table with the expression of a man receiving something he hadn't let himself want. She thought about the barn roof he'd gone up on in November and the loft he'd finished in January and the foundation reinforcement that was solid and level and built to last. She thought about James and about the way she'd said she would give a lot for one more argument with him, and about the fact that she had not stopped loving James and did not expect to, and also about the fact that loving what you've lost does not require you to refuse what's in front of you. That was something she'd figured out alone, slowly, without anyone explaining it to her, which meant she believed it more fully than she would have if someone had told her. "You know what you're signing on for," she said. "This ranch, the debt that's gone, but the work that isn't, the winters, the gap between what I have and what I want to do with the property. Clara, I'm being practical." "I know. I'm saying yes to the practical version. I've been living the practical version for 5 months. I'm still here." She looked at him for a long moment. "Yes," she said. He let out a breath. "But," she said, "you're going to have to fix the south porch rail first. It's been loose since February, and I've been waiting to see how long it would take you to notice." He looked at the porch. He looked at the rail. He looked back at her. "I noticed in February," he said. "Then what have you been waiting for?" "I wanted to see how long you'd wait before mentioning it." She picked up the feed bucket. "That is a ridiculous way to conduct a relationship." "Probably," he agreed. "We can work on it." She went to feed the chickens, and he went to get his tools, and the rail was fixed by noon. They married in June, in the yard of the ranch, with Nathaniel Cross and his wife present, and Ed Marsh and his wife, and Orville and Eleanor Henderson, and Clem Henderson, who had turned out to be exactly what Gideon had said he was: good instincts, reckless, teachable, and who stood through the ceremony with the expression of a young man who finds weddings slightly baffling but is willing to participate. Danny Pruitt came down from Salina. He arrived 2 days before the ceremony, and Gideon met him at the road, and Clara watched the two of them from the porch and did not go out, because that reunion was not hers to be part of. She saw them shake hands, and she saw Gideon say something, and she saw Danny laugh, and she went back inside and let them have it. Danny stayed through the week after the wedding and helped Gideon start on the second phase of the drainage project. And on his last evening, he sat on the porch with Clara while Gideon was finishing something in the barn, and he said, "He's different." "From what?" she said. "From before." He thought about it. He used to lead a job site like he was afraid the whole thing was going to come down at any moment, watching everything, checking everything twice. He looked out at the barn. He still checks things twice. But it's not fear now, it's just thoroughness. He paused. "That's you." "That's him," she said. "I didn't fix anything." "No," Danny said. "But something changed." She looked at the barn, where the light was still on. "Something changed," she agreed. She did not say what it was exactly, because she wasn't sure she could put it simply enough to be true. What she believed, in the form that felt most honest, was this: people did not fix each other. They couldn't. What they could do, if they were careful and willing to be present and honest about the hard things, was stand in a place where the other person had enough stability to do the work themselves. That was not a small thing. It was, in fact, most of it. By autumn, the south field drainage was finished, and the second-level barn storage was built, and the northwest foundation was solid enough to last another 50 years, which was the only standard Gideon applied to structural work. Not good enough, not fine. 50 years. He had taken on 2 more projects in the county through the year. Both came to him by reputation, which had moved through the community the way reputation does in small places, quietly, through specific people who had seen specific work and mentioned it to someone else. Roy Garrett recommended him to his brother-in-law, who recommended him to someone in the next county over. The work came steadily, in amounts that were manageable and honest. He was not building courthouses yet. He told Clara this one evening in October with a wry quality that was new in him, the ability to be funny about his own ambitions rather than burdened by them. She told him the county needed a new freight depot in town, and she'd heard the commission was being assembled. He looked at her. "Where did you hear that?" "Eleanor Henderson, who heard it from her cousin on the town council." "That's an extraordinarily indirect route to information." "That's how this county works." She looked at him. "You should put in a bid." He was quiet for a moment. She knew the shape of the quiet. It was the kind where he was doing the real arithmetic, not the surface arithmetic, but the one underneath, about whether he was ready. The load calculations for a freight depot, he said slowly, would be significant, she said. And you would check them 4 times and then check them again, and you would not cut corners because you are constitutionally incapable of cutting corners. And it would be the best freight depot in this county, and probably the next one. She met his eyes. Put in a bid, Gideon. He put in a bid in November and was awarded the commission in December. And on the evening he came home with the contract in his hand, he sat at the kitchen table where he had been sitting at kitchen tables for over a year now. And he looked at the paper and he looked up at her and said, "It's a significant project." "Yes," she said, "significant responsibility." "Yes." "I'm going to need to hire 2 additional men." "Yes." He looked at the contract again. She could see him sitting with the size of it, not afraid of it, but letting himself feel the full weight before he accepted it, because he'd learned, the hard way and permanently, that the weight was real and deserved to be acknowledged. "All right," he said. She made coffee, and they sat with the contract and planned into the evening, and that was the most ordinary thing, and it was everything. The freight depot was completed the following September. It stood on the corner of Main and Caldwell Road, solid and level and precisely as designed, and people in town said it was the finest commercial structure in the county, which was true and also not, Gideon had told Clara privately. The point is that it holds what it's built to hold, he said, for 50 years. She had looked at him and said, "That's the point of most things worth building." He had thought about that for a moment and said, "Yes, I think so." The Whitlock Ranch, which some people in the county had started calling the Mercer Place, and which Clara had mixed feelings about but was adjusting to, went into that winter with full stores, sound structures, a breeding herd that was healthy and growing, and a south field that drained properly for the first time since the property was first broken. The fence line was solid on every side. It had been solid since November of the previous year, and it stayed solid because the man who had built it understood that a fence wasn't a one-time project. It was a relationship with the land, something you checked and maintained and repaired when the weather and the time and the hard use of daily life did what they always did to things you cared about. That was what Gideon had learned to understand, not just about fences. That was what Clara had known for years, alone, and was no longer required to know alone. Neither of them were finished people. That was the truth of it, and it was also the whole point. You did not wait until you were finished to build something. You started with what you had: $2, a tool bag, a bucket of chicken feed, a broken gate, an honest sentence said to a stranger. And you built forward from there, one day at a time, one repaired thing at a time, until the structure was something that could hold what you put inside it. And if you were lucky, not lucky in the way of things handed to you, but lucky in the way of making the right choices at the right moments when the choices were hard, you built it next to someone who checked the math twice, who noticed the loose rail but waited to see if you'd mention it, who sat in a barn all night with a sick animal without being asked, who told you the truth when the truth was inconvenient, who came back to the place they'd meant to pass through and found, without planning it, that passing through had become something else entirely. The gate held, the fence held, the barn held, and what they had built inside all of that, which was not visible from the road and could not be measured in any unit anyone had agreed on, held too.